I had to make a choice. Quit being this person that was not really getting me healthy, positive results in life, or continue those same patterns.
Winners never quit, and quitters never win.
Quitters win all the time. Let us show you how on Quit Happens.
Hey everyone, Lynn Marie here. Welcome to the next episode of Quit Happens. Today's guest is Steph Sifandos. Steph facilitates transformational growth through neuro-empowerment practices, an integration of spiritual praxis and Western psychology to improve and enhance the quality of your relationships. Through his diverse, deep, and varied background, for the last 15 years, Steph has been at the forefront of innovating the global health and wellness industry, whilst being a sought-after innovator in the personal transformation, relationship, and leadership space. Now that bio sounds impressive, but just wait until you hear Steph actually share his story and his knowledge, because it's incredible. He goes so raw into his own past and his history and who he was and how he came to realize that he needed a transformation and how he made that transformation so fully and embodies that change that he helps people with today. I think you're going to really like this. This is an episode we focus a little more on relationships, and those of you who know me well know that's not necessarily my forte. So I brought Steph on to fill in the gaps where my knowledge is not completely sufficient. So I hope you really enjoy our chat. Now, before we get to Steph, if you would like to learn more about strategic quitting, you can find me at Quitting by Design on Facebook and Instagram, Quit Happens on Twitter, or you can check out my website, quittingbydesign.com, where you can pick up a copy of my book, which is conveniently called Quitting by Design. See a theme? On my site, you'll also find the link to my online course called Make Quit Happen. It's a 6-week course that walks you through the strategic quitting process step by step, and there are multiple live calls with me to discuss any questions you may have. And if one-on-one coaching is more your thing, I'd be happy to work with you privately on your unique quit. Just click the coaching tab on my website and we'll set up a chat. Also, if you'd like to be part of the Facebook group for the few, the proud, the quitters, then head over to Quitopia, the humble home for all things strategic quitting. I do extra Facebook Lives there and we can support each other through our quits. And one last thing, if you enjoy what you hear on the podcast, I'd really appreciate you leaving a rating and a review. It helps other people who may be starting their own quitting journey to find this show. Now, without further ado, thanks so much for joining us, Steph.
Thank you for having me here.
I like to start with how I know the guest, and Steph and I were introduced by Skip Kelly, who was a former podcast guest.
Yes.
Yes, and lovely human being all around.
Yes, solid human being. We both met him at A-Fest.
Oh, you met him which year?
17.
Okay,
Yes.
in Jamaica?
In Jamaica.
Oh, very cool, very cool.
Yeah.
My audience is very familiar with whatever A-Fest is, because
Very good.
half of the guests have been A-Festers at
Very
some
good.
point. So Steph is a relationship alchemist. He specializes in one of the few things that I'm always telling you guys, okay, there are lots of things in a quit that I'm great at, parts that I still have to reach out for help in other areas. And so Steph's expertise comes in relationships, and he has, of course, his own story in relationships and in his own quits, and he's very generous to come on and share those with us.
Yes.
So I appreciate that.
You're
And if you
welcome.
could take us back to a transformational relationship / breakup in your life.
Yeah. So a few years ago, and for me, it was a deeply transformative time because I didn't voluntarily, well, I did at some point after the fact, but at the beginning, I was forced to make a decision about, do I quit my previous behavior, my habits around who I was being, how I was behaving, how I was moving through the world, my thoughts, my models of reality, my thought paradigms, like how I viewed myself, or do I just continue being that person, not really make any changes or significant shifts in my life, and just keep being that person that I'd always been, which wasn't really getting me ahead. It wasn't really helping me grow. I felt very stagnant in my life, but I was so entrenched in these habits, I couldn't quit them, for lack of a better term. And so I just kept repeating the same cycles over and over again. And so when this relationship became unraveled, for me, it was my partner at the time, she discovered that I was unfaithful in that relationship, and I wasn't really connected to myself. I was very dishonest, and I had to make a choice, either quit being this person that I was being that was not really getting me healthy, positive results in life, or continue those same patterns. And so I did choose voluntarily to be a very different person and move down that rabbit hole, like really explore, well, okay, what does it mean to be a different person? What does it mean to change my habits and my worldviews? What does it mean to be a different expression of a man that I have been being? And all that came with that. And so that was a very turbulent time, but simultaneously an extremely liberating time for me as well of my life. Yeah.
So what were some of the signs? I'm guessing you said that the fact that there was infidelity and then the relationship broke up. What was it about that specific instance? Because I'm sure you probably had breakups in the past that didn't necessarily lead to the same transformation. What if there's something you can pinpoint about that time that led you to realize I really do need to make a change?
I had to quit being ignorant and I had to quit being hyper selfish. And so what really allowed me to change, that I was able to make the decision to change, was seeing and witnessing the pain in at that time my significant other and what I was causing her, the pain that my actions had caused her. And so I really internalized that and began to look at my life as a whole and just ask myself, is this the person that I want to be? Like, is this really the level of dishonesty? I was going to say honesty, but dishonesty really essentially is what it was that I want to carry in my own internal world and in the world that I occupy, especially in intimate relationship.
And what were you doing? Because now you're a relationship specialist, but what were you doing at the time?
In terms of my work?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was fluctuating between, I was in the corporate world and I was in sustainability and I was also still coaching. Obviously, I've been in the coaching space. I'm not a fan of the term coach, but we'll use it anyway because it makes sense. But coaching, mentoring, etc. I've been in that space for at least 15 years, more like 18 years or so, in some iteration or expression. It's just that I wasn't really fully embodied, and so that's why I was never really satisfied. I was never really content with the service that I was giving because I knew I was out of integrity. I was just ignoring it. I was in ignorance.
Wow.
And so coming to terms with that was something that was deeply revealing to me as well.
And I'm assuming liberating too.
Massively.
Yeah. And how did you start that process for yourself? You are a coach. You know the value of a coach. Did you reach out to a mentor or a coach or a men's group?
Most definitely. And that was a big part of it, was humbling myself enough to know. And I had seen psychologists and counselors and had mentors from a very young age, not because I thought something was wrong with me. At times it was when I was coming from a place of desperation and pain and sadness, and other times it was because I wanted to up-level myself. So I was familiar with that process, but I'd really lost connection, like I'd lost more connection to myself over the years, and was really arrogant and egotistical to think that, no, I can do it on my own. And that was a product of my own individual thought process and society's collective impression of individuation and men having to sort of be individuals in life, having to do it on their own, having to learn on their own terms. And when I began to shift and humble myself enough to say, I really need some help here because I can't see the space that is taking over who I am and allowing me to express in this particular way. I can't take ownership of that. I can't see it. I need someone to shine a light on that dark spot because I just couldn't see it. And so I had to quit arrogance. I had to quit ego. Like I really had to let a lot of that go and step into a greater sense of self and in humility as well and say, hey, I really need help because I fucked up a lot. And at that time I was using that terminology, like I was very judgmental on myself still. And I made a lot of mistakes. I've hurt a lot of people, and I went really extreme into the ownership side of things, to my detriment. And it wasn't until I really moved through that I was able to say, I simply took some actions that weren't conducive to my health and the health of others, and it's not the person I want to be anymore. It just really isn't. And so, how do I be different? How do I move through the world differently? Well, that's a more quality question as opposed to I'm not good enough, I haven't done great enough, I need to be punished for that, because that doesn't help me and it doesn't help anybody.
Yeah.
And so shifting from that paradigm of thought, that sort of that victimhood, that harsh judge mentality, into one of greater compassion and empathy was a very new journey for me as well, because I never experienced, I shouldn't say never, I seldom experienced compassion and empathy as a child, especially if I made a mistake, or if I said something that was out of alignment, or I did something that was out of alignment, I was really reprimanded harshly for that. And so that was the only real sense of understanding how to rectify action that I was exposed to, as opposed to, hey, let's be compassionate, let's be empathetic, let's understand why you're doing what you're doing, let's sit down, there's no judgment here, I'm not going to scream at you, I'm not going to scold you. And so it was really making a massive transition in terms of how I spoke to myself and treated myself.
That's really powerful, because I was speaking in an interview yesterday with Drew Manning, and we were talking about the Mormon church putting a lot of shame on people if they've done wrong. But it doesn't have to be a church. There are definitely family systems that are set up like that.
Massively, especially in my culture and my ethnicity as well, being of Mediterranean European descent. It's just so harsh, like and screaming and aggression, verbal aggression, emotional aggression, it's really the norm for most cases. And so I grew up thinking that is normal. That's so you're talking about letting go and releasing and surrendering to and quitting. So shame and guilt was a massive part of that, because that unconsciously drove a lot of my overt actions in the world, and the way I treated other people as well, the way I showed up to relationship.
Yeah, did you find that in this quitting process, where you're quitting, there's like a hierarchy, right? And you're like, okay, this is the overarching thing, is I'm going to quit trying to be selfish. But then as you dialed back, I'm assuming that you found some mindsets in there that you had to quit along the way.
Oh yeah, for sure. Mindsets around a man's role and a woman's role in relationship. That was massive, and that still really debunking that at more of a collective level. How that permeates the essence of our society as well. And I won't go too deep down the rabbit hole with that conversation, even though that's something that I love speaking to, and it's something that I teach extensively, is that masculine feminine dynamic, and that paradox, in fact, and finding the harmony in our expressions as human beings. And so finding that balance point. And so that was something that I really had to shift that mindset around that. My mindset around, well, if I'm not this person that I've been, who I've identified myself as a cheat, I've identified myself as someone that is guilty and full of shame, and someone that is unfaithful and not mistrusting and dishonest. And if I'm not those things, then what am I? And because you know that old saying, like, it's better the devil you know. So the familiarity elicits such safety that we can remain in that space, even though it's unhealthy long term. And so coming face to face with not wanting to be that person, or not wanting to express those characteristics in the world, and yet being left with, well, what's actually next? Like, yeah, I can conceptualize, hey, I can be honest, hey, I can be selfless, hey, I can be more aware, hey, I can be more empowered and compassionate, and I can be more transparent. But that's intellectual. Like, to embody that, I've never done that to that extent. So what does that actually mean? Like, it's almost the ego's facing annihilation or death. And so you've got to let go of all of that. I had to let go of that. And so for me, it was making a decision of, I'm all into this transformation. That includes death, that includes ending up in a mental asylum, because your mind goes, like, your brain wanders, your brain stem and your amygdala start to play out the scenarios, like, what's the worst case scenario, let's prepare for that. And so I prepared for that and accepted that. And of course it's not where I went, although there were times when my mind was so fractured in the transition that I felt I didn't even feel myself. I didn't know what I was and who I was. Like, I was just so disorientated, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, relationally, just disorientated.
Wow. You said something that I think a lot of people resonate with. Intellectually you need to make all these other things, but the how comes up, right? I think our mutual friend Connor had this video he put on social media yesterday, like, everybody just says love yourself, but how do you do that? And so what tools, if you could share, did you use to start to make those esoteric ideas more like real things that you could accomplish?
I didn't so much do anything new. It's how I did what I was doing. And so for me, the foundation for any transformation is intention and attention. I shared this earlier with someone I was speaking to. you hear that old adage, that story of two brothers, and they grow up in a very similar or same family, and one becomes a successful entrepreneur and the other one becomes a criminal or a drug addict. Like, what happened? What's the difference? And the fundamental difference, albeit complexities and there's layers to what's actually transpired, the fundamental difference is that one person has moved with a very specific intention and has paid attention to their environment and to their actions and has adjusted and made iterations along the way in alignment with what they want. They have clarity. And so intention and attention gives us clarity. And so for me, I began to carry more intent with the action that I was taking. I thought to myself, I'm going to spend not so much more time in nature, but I'm going to spend very deliberate time in nature. I'm going to allow nature I'm going to connect more to nature, to the ocean. So I was in, cold water immersion therapy, and I would call it therapy, but it was just me being in the ocean. I was doing that often anyway, but I was doing it with an intention to, what can I actually take from this and what can I give as I'm taking? So spending time with nature is very healing for the organism, because there's a physiological, biological resonance there that our bodies have with nature that places us in harmony. And so what I found was that when I was in this more harmonious state of being, I was more open in my mind and in my heart, in my emotional being. Heart being a metaphor for our emotional being. And therefore I was able to be more creative with my problem solving. I was able to be more creative with how I addressed pain points and issues, as opposed to feeling stuck and thinking, oh my Lord, there's only one vantage point, there's only one perspective here, I can't shift this. And so nature really helped with that. I seek help, like outside of myself, like mentors, spiritual guides, psychologists, counselors, healers. People that had been where I had been in different ways, had traversed the fear, the transition, the pain, and had come out the other end. And so I sought those people and I spent time with those people. I also began to change the way, but before I changed the way I spoke to myself and communicated with my own self, because then I would just project that onto others, that harshness, I began to observe. So I simply observed, how am I speaking to myself? How am I communicating with myself? How am I feeling about my actions that I take? And I was taking note of that. Like, I was literally noting my thoughts and observing any sequences, or observing any so the words eluded me. Similarities or coincidences in my thought patterns. So I was looking for, where am I doing the same thing and can I change that? Is it serving me? And so I began that process of observation. That was very important as well. Allocating alone time. All too often, especially men, we isolate ourselves and we busy ourselves in our external world and we isolate ourselves in our internal world, thinking and feeling that we've got no one that we can lean on. And so instead of doing that unconsciously, I was consciously spending time on my own, being with my thoughts. And I was having some very intense thoughts, like some very negative thoughts, deep remorse, a sadness, pain and fear that was arising, and just being with that, like not judging that, not saying, I'm not allowed to feel that, I better suppress that more, so then I would be driven to behave in an unconscious way again. And so spending time on my own, a great deal of time on my own, and allowing, like giving permission to myself to express in any way. If I had to go and hit boxing bags for 2 hours, that's what I did. If I had to go for a 2-hour run, then that's what I did. If I had to sit on the floor in my lounge room and cry and splutter and scream and hit a pillow and whatever I needed to do, if I needed to write, if I needed to read, I just allowed myself a great deal, which is something that I hadn't done in the past. Like, I was very stoic in the past in an unhealthy way, in an extreme way. Whereas, like, if I'm not behaving in a specific way within this parameter of rigidity, then I'm not worthy. And so I softened a lot more without compromising my own inner strength as well. And at the same time, allowing myself to express and not viewing it as weakness. And that was some massive shifts for me as well.
I think that's a big thing, especially for men, is to find the soft, but not mistake it for weak. And I've heard from a lot of male guests that men's work has helped them kind of work through that. And at this point in time, when you're going through and you've got mentors and you've got assistants, were there friendships that you had to quit because they weren't necessarily in line with this new person that you were learning about.
Yes. Yeah, that was very hard because, and I'll tell you the link and the connection there. So, for me, I grew up, as I said, largely in a quite a violent and an abusive home, and so it was a very strict home as well for the large part. And so I cultivated friendships in my neighborhood at the age of sort of 11, 12, and they were like it's like an escapism. And so we formed very deep bonds, and these friendships like took into my adulthood. And so, friendships for like 10, 15, 20 years. And so there was a very deep connection in terms of like these friends, like we've shared so much, we've experienced so much together, we've been through such varied life experiences, we've bonded, we've been intimate with each other at a deep platonic level, like there's so much love there. And yet our values weren't aligned when I started really unpacking me and unlayering who I was. And so having to make that decision, I was losing another safety net. Like my friends were a massive safety net, so, a particular group.
Yeah.
And so losing that, losing is not the right word, releasing that from my life was at that time extremely confronting. And I didn't want to do it, but parts of me knew I had to.
Yeah, absolutely. Because at least in my experience, I find that I feel a completely different way when I'm around friends that are out of alignment with what I'm doing. And that starts more negative self-talk than almost anything. Is I feel like when I'm out in surroundings that are just completely out of line with my values or what is important to me right then. And is that part of what you were feeling, like that it's hard for me to move on and continue down this road
Yes.
if I have people who are still kind of in this old mindset and they might not, trigger is not the word, but they kind of like spurn a feeling when you're around them.
Yes. Very accurate in how you've said that. And essentially, I would continue to be out of integrity. And so I wanted to be in integrity. I wanted my inner world, my thoughts, my emotions, my beliefs, my models of reality to match my outer world, my expressions, my behaviors, my interactions, my actions themselves. And so that meant looking at every area of my life and really giving up, letting go, quitting so much of the older self.
At this point, did you pause your relationship life? So you thought, okay, let's take a pause. I want to go into my next relationship as this new person.
That's exactly what I did. I was blessed enough as well that my partner at that time, and she didn't, very thankfully for me, and I'm very grateful for this, is she didn't play to her own patterns of, hey, you've done this, I'm out of here. She stayed. So we managed to attempt to reconcile for a few months. And so what that gave me, the gift that gave me was me in real time being able to be different, like to really be different and practice it where there was so much tension and so much difficulty in conversation and so much like shedding of the ego that had to take place and confrontation as well, like because I had to get honest. And so that allowed me, because let's just say she left immediately, it would have been largely conceptual. I wouldn't have had the embodied practice. And I actually made significant changes even in that short period of time, just with her whilst we were attempting to reconcile. And that was a massive gift to my up-leveling of my own consciousness, my own self, my own growth in the world. Yeah.
Wow. Hey friends, it's Lynn Marie, and I wanted to let you know about 2 incredible offers I've gotten for Quit Happens listeners. First, I'd love to have you check out the supplement that helps me stay on my mental game when doing interviews and recording podcasts and taking care of all the things involved in running my budding quitting empire, and that is Qualia by Neurohacker. I had Dr. Greg Kelly, lead formulator at Neurohacker, on the show recently, and the folks there have been so generous to give Quit Happens listeners a 15% discount on all products by using the coupon code QUIT. So go to neurohacker.com and enter code QUIT at checkout. Also, I'd love to share the tool that's been the most helpful to me in the past year in making sure I'm getting adequate sleep and taking recovery days when necessary. It's the Aura Ring, a biotracking ring that does a full sleep study on you every night and then takes a number of other biometrics into consideration in telling you whether you're good to go full blast that day or if you may need a little R&R. And Quit Happens listeners can get the Aura at $50 off. Yes, that is 50. Just go to auraring.com/partners/quit, and that's spelled OURA ring.com/partners/quit. You can check out the show notes for links to both of these offers. Okay, back to the show. So, for the listeners who may be undergoing a similar quit or a different quit, say that would involve somebody they're in a relationship with, and it can either be, a job might somehow peripherally involve the person that you're in a relationship with, or if you need to change cities, or even if you're changing a mindset, because that might end up leading to you being a slightly different person than they signed up for originally. Can you give some thoughts in your now expertise with relationships on how to have those conversations before when you're in the preparation for a quit phase? Say it's something that is not a mindset, a little more external. Any suggestions you would give for how to communicate with a person's partner or family or friends about the change that they're going to go through so that the relationships can be preserved or not, if maybe they're not working or they're not best suited for that transition?
There's three things that I would say on that. The first is connect to the fact that if you don't communicate your truth, the pain of not communicating your truth outweighs the potential pain of communicating your truth. So get really fucking real with that, because that's a very real reality.
Absolutely.
Number one. Number two, there needs to be a willingness. Like, we have to carry a willingness within ourselves to want to be the best version of ourselves. And that is an ideal. That is an ideal that we hold, or a belief system, that when we attune to that belief system and that model of reality, that I want to present the best version of me possible forward. And if I'm not being honest, is that the best version of me? And we can answer that truthfully, then we're more inclined to be honest. So there's got to be a willingness. And that really comes from here and viscerally our body being integrated, willing to grow, like prioritizing growth. Growth is our primary directive, and everything we do supports that. And if our actions don't support growth, then they're not healthy actions long term. And the third thing that I would say is approach any conversation or potential transition with compassion, understanding, and empathy. Because when we do, our guard is down. We're not coming to someone attacking them. Because neurologically and socially, if I came to you from my wounded self, from fear and pain, all that's going to evoke in you is fear and pain. And all you're going to do is get defensive and react, not respond, but react to my emotional vomit instead of the actual message that I'm attempting to give you. And so when we come with understanding and compassion, our tonality changes, our posturing changes, our physical posture changes, our intention changes. We begin to think about the other person. We begin to contemplate, what is it that they need? What is it that they require in order to grow from this as well? We start coming from a place of what I call selfish selflessness. And it's what's the term? It's an up-leveling from enlightened self-interest, where we're looking after our own interests and the interests of others at the same time, simultaneously. And it's not an easy thing to do. It is an ideal to strive for. And there's a number of characteristics six characteristics that exemplify this notion. And so when we step into this posture of selfish selflessness, we're able to be more present to what the other person needs are as well. In turn, actually giving us what we need too. And I learned to practice that, and I still do practice it. Like it's an art that is ever evolving.
I really appreciate that. I was wondering, you said there are 6. Would you like to elaborate?
I'll elaborate on a couple of them.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first is that we're coming from a place of sustainability. And so what that means is the decisions that we're making when we're being selfishly selfless, tongue twister sometime, is coming from a place of longevity. Like, is it a short-term gratification, or is there more than that? Like, can we actually see the long-term
Yeah.
benefits of our actions right now? And like, really, does it carry long-term benefits? Asking that question. The second is inclusivity. Like, are we inclusive in our decision making, or are we solely making a decision based on our needs and nobody else's? Very, very important as well. So being inclusive, and there's that selfless aspect. And inclusive means inclusive of our needs as well. Another premise or characteristic of this selfish selflessness is that we're relational beings. So understanding that we're pro-social beings, we've evolved that way. So we function at our highest, at our optimal, at our highest potential, at our peak, when we're being relational beings, collaborative, not competitive. So there's three major points of the
I love that.
Yeah, of the selfish selfless model.
So say somebody is in a relationship and they end up, either person ends up making a shift, or for whatever reason, the relationship no longer seems as in line with one person's greatest values and passions and purpose as with the other. And they come to the point where they're trying to make a decision. Is this something I should continue to pursue, or is it time to make a quit? And obviously this is not an easy question. Like, here's how you know whether or not you need to break up. But are there some overarching themes that you would say, okay, if you notice, I mean, granted, there's couples counseling and all these kinds of things, but say they've tried whatever method it is, and there's something deeper. Is there something you could maybe give a clue as to, okay, if this deeper thing is speaking to you in the relationship, that tells you, okay, maybe it's worth trying some more, or maybe it's worth letting go of?
That's great. So I'll come back to willingness and commitment. And that can be really driven by values alignment as well. So if your core values, and I'm going to get to another point, the main point that I'm getting to in a moment. If your core values are aligned, there's more of an inclination to persevere, to continue down this path together and explore. And so the reality of all of that is, if you don't know yourself, if you don't carry what I call self-gnosis, which is embodied knowledge, wisdom, if you don't have wisdom around who you are, what your likes are, what your dislikes are, how you wish to be treated in relationship, what your ideals are in relationship, how you wish to live your life, where you wish to live, at a superficial level, what house do you want to live in, what car do you want to drive, what clothes do you like to wear, what are your tastes, what food do you like eating, what are you agreeable and not agreeable to, like what are your go-tos and what are not in terms of coping strategies when you're facing difficulty or pain or challenge. You know, how do you argue? How do you communicate? How do you prefer to be treated? You know, how do you want to be sexually in a relationship? Like, we don't explore these questions. And so if you don't know yourself, and of course the self is ever evolving, it's not fixed, it's ever changing. It's impermanent. And so you can't know yourself 100% all the time, but it's about being aware of and willing to explore yourself. So when you come to a relationship, knowing what your core needs are and knowing what you have bandwidth to give and what you wish to receive, and knowing what your pain points in life are, your traumas, your potentially unresolved childhood issues, most of us have them, not everyone, but most of us have them, largely unresolved, some resolved, but even knowing what they have been and what they are, understanding the patterns in your previous relationship. When you come to a relationship with that level of awareness and consciousness, and the other person does, you will both be willing to see beyond the immediate pain of a conflict or a discussion that is, you butting heads. Whereas an unconscious relationship where people haven't done that deeper work on themselves, and they show up to relationship triggered, and they show up to relationship taking everything personally, there's not much hope for those relationships.
I like that very much. And it got me to thinking about why in the later years, I think it's harder to find a relationship, but they seem to last a little longer, because you should know, in theory, if you've done some work, know yourself slightly better than when you were 20 and you're like, let's just date. You're cute. I'm cute. Or then you guys get together. But I realized that so many people, I'm 41, that at this point, we're just not going to waste our time on somebody whose values are completely out of alignment, because now we should, or more, but it is more likely that we do know what those values are.
Yeah. I completely agree. And so the spin to that is that there's, we can see life in any way we want. We can hold any perspective we want in life. And so for me, meeting my fiancée, Christine, in later life, and the caveat to that is that we had both done very deep work on it and continue to do so. But it hit a point where we had done deep work, so we're very clear on what we both want. And coming from that place is really helpful. And sometimes the antithesis to that is that the older you are, not choosing not to be aware and remain in ignorance means that you become more entrenched in rigid habits, meaning it becomes really difficult to find someone if that's what you want to, if you want to find someone to be in intimate relationship with, or someone's, like plural, if you want to be with, that's bad grammar, but
We do live in Encinitas.
well, depending on
Yeah.
what your sexual preferences are or your relationship preferences are in terms of monogamy or non-monogamy, you will struggle to find a sustainable relationship that carries harmony and growth if you're entrenched in habits that are unhealthy and do not suit you because you've chosen not to look at the stuff that's really hindering you. And that's the simplicity of it. Like fuck, that is it. Like that's the simplicity of it. So it can work for you or against you depending on your own predisposition. And for me, that's about self-awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all very valuable. Steph, thank you very much for everything you've shared. Again, I always tell the listeners, there are a few things I'm not great at, finance and relationships. So I'm very, very thankful that you came on and shared all of this stuff that you have learned, because I'm guessing that your deep dive into the relationship started at this time when you had the self-exploration, right?
Yeah, it did. And, the interesting thing is that I had, from a very young age, I had begun to explore, various extensions, expressions of Eastern mysticism, Western philosophy, psychology, and I had been quite intellectual or cognitive around how people interact in the mind, but I wasn't embodied because I wasn't living it. I was living a lie. Like I was living so many lies. And I can't tell you how liberating it is to not live lies anymore. Like it's just it's heaven on earth. It really is, because you're not hiding. I'm not hiding anymore. And so when I'm not hiding, I have a greater propensity to want to be me. There's less judgment. There's less pain associated around my actions. There's more openness. There's greater honesty, connection, transparency. There's my intimate bonds are even deeper because I'm choosing to not hide. And so making that decision a few years ago, where I chose to be embodied in the knowledge that I had and also redefine the knowledge that I had, that was a game changer for me. It's the embodiment. Like it really is that. It's the embodiment. It's the integration of knowing something and then actually living it in full. That's the power for anyone. And I've experienced that directly, and I see it in the people that I work with, the women, the men that I work with on a continual basis.
And I would love to, in just a minute, have you let everybody know if they'd like to work with you, how they can find you. But I have one last question, because I asked on Instagram, did anybody have a question for you? And I'm going to misquote this question, but I know that it probably gets to the heart of one of the things you're most passionate about. Somebody asks something very kind of general, but I think I get what he meant. He said, how do you be a man? And I think that is a giant question, but I think if we're going to go ahead and go with the quitting theme that I tend to, maybe what he was asking is, in this day and age, if you could just give us a few minutes on maybe quitting what you said your idea of how you were supposed to be a man was when you made the shifts and the transformations into a person who was able to feel and still be strong.
Yeah. It's a great question because there's so much confusion around femininity, but more so masculinity in contemporary times. Men are changing rapidly. Like the landscape of the cultural expression of man is changing. I mean, we have at least unofficially 70 gender types right now. Like we've moved well beyond binary gender. The fact that there's a conversation about that, there's 70, and this isn't about wrong or right. This is about the diversity that we're experiencing as a humanity and as a society right now. And so what does it mean to be a man is a really, really challenging question. And so the way I respond to that is in a few ways. Firstly, we need to define what masculinity is for us as our own subjective expression. And for all those that hate subjective relativism or cultural relativism out there, and what that means is that every individual opinion matters and carries weight. And there are some schools of philosophical thought that despise that, and I get that. There is also a framework that we need to, or for lack of a better term, objective framework you need to abide by. And that is more vested in our biology, and I'll get to that in a moment. And so I developed a 12-principle model called the Conscious Warrior of what it means to be a man in contemporary times. And so there's 12 principles. in a circular fashion because they all feed into each other. And they're not so much characteristics, they're more what I call posturings, like how do we be in the world? So as an example, what the first actual principle is ownership, responsibility, and personal power. And so what does it mean to be a man in contemporary times? Part of that is our ability to take ownership for everything that we are. Now, that's a very loaded statement. Ownership and responsibility for our past, collective and individual, and our present. And so that's looking at our socio-cultural frameworks, that's looking at our dominant social paradigms, that's looking at as who we as men individually, or how do we express, how do you express as an individual, looking at the shadow self, looking at our pains, our fears, all of those challenges that we face and assimilating them into who we are today and acknowledging them, taking ownership for them, taking responsibility for them. This leads to a greater sense of stability and safety. Traditionally, men have been seen to be either very stable and safe or harming. Like, I mean, you don't have to go very far back in history. Even today, it's not. You can look at our political systems. You can look at the warmongering that is occurring. What gender is at the forefront of that? Like, so there's reasons that these are unhealthy expressions of man's biological need to exert strength, exert power. There's other ways to do it. We're changing. The world is changing massively. We don't need to see. There's this argument around biology and that we're born hunters and we're born to be competitive and we're born to take what we want and we've evolved this way and that's the way it is. Yes, but our socio-cultural landscape has changed massively. And so we can take the essence of that and that biology and we can redirect the energy in different ways. And some of the ways that we do it is in competitive sport. Okay, it's one way. Again, it's probably a conversation for another time. It's a rabbit hole. But what does it mean to be a man is first begin to understand why you want to know how to be a man and what does it mean to you. And so some of the characteristics for me personally that I believe are vital to being a man in contemporary times is having clarity and assertiveness. So clear assertiveness in self. This doesn't mean being dominant. This doesn't mean being oppressive or opinionated. This means being clear on who you are and taking action on that clarity. So there's congruency in self. Being what I call vertically vulnerable. So you're confident in yourself and you're able to express your feelings, understanding that men have a limbic system. We have an emotional, regulatory, neurological system that needs to be expressed. There's an integration, a greater intelligence and wisdom that is uptaken into us when we're able to express our emotions in real time with respect to responding to our environment. So carrying emotional intelligence is part of what it means to be a man. Being discerning. In other words, and this comes from clarity and knowing self, carrying self-gnosis, being discerning in the decisions that we make, being honest. For too long collectively, generally speaking, men have been dishonest. We need to flip that paradigm. It's about being honest. Tapping into our compassionate selves, being inclusive in our decision-making in the way that we move in the world. In other words, not excluding others at our benefit, not being hyper-selfish, letting go a lot of the shame, the collective shame and the guilt. Because what's also happening now in certain pockets is that men are being shamed for the past. That's not going to help and it's not going to work. Yes, we still have to take ownership and responsibility for who we've been as a collective and who we are and who we've been as individuals, and to do that in a way that is compassionate so that we can all move forward and uplift and uplevel each other together. Now, this is a very complex conversation and no one has an answer on this. It's a great question that your viewers ask, but no one has an answer on this. So it really is about having an open discussion and choosing what resonates with you. One of the things I will say with men is that we need to be fucking strong. Like, I mean physically strong. Biologically, the way we're structured internally, we are strong men. We are strong human beings. And so if we don't allow ourselves to express that strength, it either gets suppressed and gets redirected in a negative way in society or in relationships or towards ourselves. So simply just being strong as a man, like having integrated strength, like training the body, moving the body, like with intent, that's very important. That's a big part of being a healthy human. It's a big part of being a man. Massive.
Ooh, I love all of that. Thank you so much. I'm glad we finally I know that that's probably your zone of genius is this male female integration exploration, and I'm glad that almost nobody ever answers my Instagram questions, and I was very pleased that somebody I've never spoken with before is
Right.
ask this one. And I was like, oh yes, that's beautiful,
Right.
because I know that we've had multiple guests on, and part of their entire quit was quitting expectations of what it was to be a man.
Yeah, massively. Same as me, very much. The roles, the traditional conventional roles of men and women. I've had to give up a lot just coming to live here in the US. I was very well connected in Australia. I'd spent most of my life there. I always tell this joke, if there's anything you needed a plumber, you needed a rubber, you needed a couch, you needed a car. I had someone for every, I was just that type of person, really well connected and had great friends. And here, I've had to start up again, and so that's been an eye opener as well into my own masculinity, because what all of that represented was self-reliance and self-assurance. What it represented was connectivity. What it represented was even a form of power, not in a negative way, but just having the ability to help others and be in contact. And here now, I don't have that nowhere near as much. So I've got to rebuild that. So that immediately affects aspects of my sense of self. And so having to reconcile that and realizing that, hey, I'm still a man. I still carry masculinity within me. It's just, how is that expressed now, and how can I see that and view that, witness it differently?
I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think a lot of people go through that when they make a major transformation. They're like, who am I now?
Yeah.
And
I don't have any of my close friends here either.
Yeah.
I'm rebuilding that tribe as well. That was a massive identity for me. I would have men, close friends and brothers that I would train with and exercise with and move my body with. And we would really train at intensity as well. And it was great. A couple of hours every day, 7 days a week for years, and then no more.
Gone.
It's where does that sense of self go that I identified with for so long? And so part of being a masculine, being a healthy human being is being agile and being able to also look at the pain that you're experiencing, or that I was experiencing, acknowledge that pain that I was experiencing, and not being a victim in it. And more importantly, asking myself, okay, well, what can it teach me, and what do I need to be now to continue to grow in different ways? Because that's never going to leave me. It's always going to be there. And how can I not fill that void, but how can I be constructive in how I spend my energy and how I divert my energy? And so more healthy questions to ask, but it gives me an opportunity to ask those questions and then act on them.
Ooh, thank you for all of that. Let people know where they can find you if they would like to work more, if this lovely gentleman who asked the question or anybody else would like to work more with you on relationships, masculinity, femininity, all those things, where can they find you?
Yeah, simply my social media handle is Stefanos Safandos, or you can go to my website, stefanosafandos.com.
And we'll put that all in the show notes. Thank you again for sharing your beautiful home and all of your wisdom with us.
Thank you, Maria. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. For everybody else out there, until next time, happy quitting.